Welcome to Mindshift, I'm Brandon, and today's Tuesday Takedown features a very inconsistent priest that goes by the name of Father Josiah Trenlim. This isn't the first time we've covered this channel. You might remember this video for those of you that were here very early on. However, it was a different priest covering a different topic, that of gay marriage, and this one is about children. Now, this channel chose to promote this in a 1-minute short, so I'm just replying to what they have put out. I did watch the 20 minutes roughly that surrounds this interview. I'll link the entire hour-and-a-half interview down below, but I'm not taking anything out of context here in covering this. So let's just watch this 1-minute clip and dive in.
A child, one child, is more precious to God than the entire world. That's how precious children are. When Christians have God's attitude about a human being, then of course families embrace children. When we have the devil's attitude, which is that children are a burden, there's nothing special about human beings, we're just animals, a little more complex than apes, we have no soul. I was raised with this idea also that, oh, children, if you want them, one or two, if you want them, when you want them. Well, I discovered in serving Christ and studying the scriptures that that attitude is completely backwards.
So you can see very brief, but he drops a lot of things that I think we need to pick up and I'm excited to cover with you. So a little bit of zooming out. This is an interview where this priest is talking about the relationship between family and evangelism. Specifically, he's getting questioned on how he manages all of his own children, of which he has 10. Much of the advice is the biblical worldview that the most important thing is marriage, and the point of that marriage being to make babies. He goes on to talk about how the very first thing whispered into the ear of man after creation is to be fruitful and multiply.
God is very interested in families and very interested in children. The first words that ever entered into the human ear, the first words from God, be fruitful and multiply. Fill the earth, rule it and subdue it. To cover the earth with human beings is to cover the earth with the glory of God.
Funny then, all of the death and destruction that this God orders. If his very glory is represented in people, a worldwide flood to kill them all might not have been the best thing. But I digress. So that's kind of the context of this conversation. Let's dive in piece by piece. Here's the first part.
A child, one child, is more precious to God than the entire world.
Someone should have told that to God. You know, I don't want to just sit in the Old Testament here, although this priest is constantly quoting from the Old Testament, and the dissonance to not understand how incorrect this statement is biblically and just by the philosophy of this religion. One child is more important than the entire world. This is like a real stretch of that lost sheep example. If one child was more important than the entire world shouldn't have been drowned, including all of those innocent children. So it's a nice thought, even though it doesn't really make sense because the entire world would contain billions of children. And if each children is more important than the other billions of children, then eventually none of those children become important. That's just a little bit of a paradox in the statement, but it doesn't play itself out in reality in any way, biblically speaking. Whether we do reference the flood or we do reference all of the verses where God commands to have children killed, how can you hold on to these words about the dignity, the inherent value of life, while we see nothing but a God that has so little care for life? And the main apologetic there is obvious and it is simple. In fact, we heard it from Craig in his conversation with Alex that, oh, it's a free pass home to heaven.
If God wants to end the life of these Canaanite children early, that's his prerogative. On my theology, these children go immediately to heaven. It was actually a tremendous blessing to these children for them to be killed and go to heaven and be with God.
Which I haven't talked about this excuse a lot, and I think it deserves a lot more detail than I'm going to give it now. But the most basic and simple thing we could say about this is if it is better for these children to immediately go to heaven before they have any experience, then all of the excuses made for the problem of evil or suffering, about how we need it to know what joy is, because without pain there is no joy, or without fear there is no courage, all of these values that are supposedly so important to get, that is why we have this testing ground of a fallen earth, they get dismantled entirely. Each and every excuse. If it is actually better for a child before he gets this opportunity for suffering to go to heaven. You can't have your cake and eat it too with this one. So I think you need to pick a lane between suffering being good and wanting children to be able to grow up to experience said suffering so they can get the glory that is waiting for them in heaven, in which case you have no out whatsoever for a God that kills children. Or if you pick the lane that it is better to die immediately and just go to heaven and get a free pass on this world, then you need to actually deal with the problem of evil and suffering. So whichever route you want to go, let me know and we'll go down that rabbit hole together. But insofar as this video goes, just making a claim that a single child's life is so important to God doesn't hold up textually. It doesn't hold up to the actions. If I said children were so important to me, more important than anything else, and you found that I had murdered my children, how much would you care about the statement that I had made? Not at all, because it would be obvious that I didn't mean it because of my actions. And we should be able to hold God to that same standard, if not higher.
When Christians have God's attitude about a human being, then of course families embrace children. When we have the devil's attitude, which is that children are a burden, there's nothing special about human beings, we're just animals, a little more complex than apes, we have no soul.
So next he makes this comparison between Christians that have the attitude of God about human beings, again, probably that inherent dignity, supposedly. The result of that is having children. And he compares it with those that have the devil's attitude, where children are a burden and there's nothing special about them. People don't even have souls. And he doesn't really finish that thought. But we can see the setup in this comparison, and I want to talk about it. First of all, having the attitude that God has, which results itself in having children. And again, the greater context here is he's talking about the selfishness of the non-believer to limit how many children they have, to use things like, oh no, birth control. Yep, that's a big part of this conversation.
Because the sexual revolution has its origin there, and this is such an offensive aspect of our ethics. Contraception is explicitly forbidden by the church. It is forbidden. And I'm not just talking about abortifacient contraception. Remember, the quest for contraception is essentially fallen man's quest to have the pleasure without the responsibility.
How evil of them to deny what God has clearly put us here for, which is why he has 10 children. And it says nothing of how to treat the child. It puts the value on the number, the quantity, not the quality. If you come from a Christian background, I'm sure you know families that took verses from the Bible very seriously and they did not have birth control and they continue to have kids that they could not afford or that they did not have the will for, that they weren't interested in. And it leads to poverty and it leads to abuse and it leads to neglect. We see this play out at its extreme from specifically Catholic missionaries in countries like Africa, where they teach that condoms or any kind of birth control is a sin. They scare the people literally with hell, while these individuals continue to infect others with HIV, leading to these children as well in absolute levels of poverty and illness. Because it's more important to be fruitful and multiply than to be responsible, according to this line of thought. But again, going back to it saying nothing of how to treat the children, or that just because you're a Christian, you're going to treat your children well. No. And we have so many stats that I have covered in this video to show that that is not true. But here's just a few that I'll give you. First of all, documented, and we have a huge documentation issue because of other verses in the Bible about not airing your dirty laundry out for non-believers. But since the 1950s, 7,000 priests, just like this guy, not saying he's done it, but in his position, have been found guilty of sexually abusing thousands and thousands and thousands of these precious little children. We know that more physical abuse happens in Christian households. They don't consider it physical abuse, oftentimes because they're backing it up with scriptures like, don't spare the rod, you'll spoil the child. We know that the vast majority of abusers of children sexually are Christian. The stats are staggering. Again, I list all of the studies in that video. Almost any stat that you want to look at, whether it is physical abuse, sexual abuse, neglect, poverty levels, etc., is equal to or worse within Christian communities. So can we just drop all of the pretense that somehow Christians are so much more suited without the devil's attitude towards having children? They are not. And it goes to say the opposite as well, that secular people that have children don't just treat them horribly and abuse them and don't care about them, which is what is being alluded to here. In fact, let's be more specific and walk through exactly what he said. The first thing he said is that the attitude of the devil is that children are a burden. The hypocrisy here is too much for me to take.
I think, of course, there are burdens. Of course there are. There are burdens with childbearing.
Does this priest have the devil's attitude? I just can't believe the inconsistency throughout this entire interview. Go watch the whole thing. If anything, I'm doing this priest a favor by only covering the 1 minute that he put out.
There's nothing special about human beings. We're just animals, a little more complex than apes. We have no soul.
An evolutionary acceptance that we are indeed animals does not immediately lead to a viewing of humans as no different than animals. Most humans, non-Christians, non-believers, will still say there is something unique or different about the experience of being a human, even from a selfish perspective. I may not have a grounded base to put it in, but I would of course apply preference to a human child over a tadpole if I could only save one. You can say that makes me inconsistent in my moral belief system, and maybe it's just an emotivist motivation coming from me, and I'm fine with that. But I do think humans are special. In fact, I think they're so special that we shouldn't limit ourselves to being a product of a narcissistic, egotistical God that wanted to replicate himself all over the earth, which is the idea that this priest gives us. I think we're special because over the course of evolution, we have done what the other animals have not. We have cultivated things like fire that allowed for our stomach to take up less calories, thus growing our potential for our brain and leading to larger language centers in the brain that helped us communicate better, or at least more thoroughly than other animals. That communication led the way for stronger bonds in certain senses, etc., all the way through. I don't care if it's an evolutionary base versus a magical Christian base. The fact remains that we are here and we are doing something that others are not. I've never seen a chimp with a podcast. I've never heard a dolphin philosophize. I also don't know what it is to be whatever it is to be a chimp or a dolphin. So of course there's a preference to humans. And what is he trying to make of this? That anyone that doesn't have the proper belief system of the God-given innate specialness of a human being and thus child can't properly care for one? Because that doesn't follow. And that honestly seems to be what he's trying to say in this comparison. Do atheists not want children? Do atheists not care for their children? Do we not feed our children? Do we not love our children? Well, it's not real love because what is love? It's just a chemical reaction that's happening in your brain. You have no grounded basis for why you care about them. As if I can't feel the same thing for my children that my Christian wife does. How stupid of an argument. There's a lot I'm unsure about in this world, a lot that I have messed up, a lot of things I am still figuring out. One of them is not how much I love my children or my ability to love them. And I need no God to do it. And for all the Christians out there abusing their kids while having the witness of the Holy Spirit and the correct viewpoint of the unique special life that is a human child, how do you explain that then? Maybe it sounds to me like people are people, and some people, because of certain conditions, environments, culture, trauma, backgrounds, etc., view and treat children differently, worse or better for their ultimate well-being than others. And then maybe these titles of believer versus non-believer, or God attitude versus devil attitude are incorrect, limiting, ignorant, and useless. I can't tell you how much I hate this kind of thinking.
I was raised with this idea also that, oh, children, if you want them, one or two, if you want them, when you want them. Well, I discovered in serving Christ and studying the scriptures that attitude is completely backwards.
So, according to scripture, the following 3 statements of advice for parenting are completely backwards. Now, he does it with shorthand, just saying, if you want children, when you want children, 1 or 2. And I believe what these 3 things represent are, yes, the desire for children first before having them. This goes a long way. Second, when you want children means being prepared, maybe being in a financial position to actually take care of them, or an emotional, mature standpoint to be able to take care of them. Very important. And 1 or 2, I don't think means literally only have 1 or 2. I think it means don't have more than you can provide for. And by the way, all 3 of these things protect children. If you really care about the innocence, the human value of life, considering these 3 things before having children should be a must. And yet he is saying it's completely backward advice. And he would be right, by the way, according to the Bible, that doesn't care about any of that. That compares children to the arrows in a quiver. The more, the better. To be fruitful and multiply. The more, the better. Again, saying nothing of protecting them. 613 commandments in the Old Testament, not one of them being don't sexually abuse children. 1,000 bees or should in the New Testament, and only 1 or 2 reference children. And simply fail in doing a thorough or complete or good job of actually providing good parental advice. If you're playing off the averages, of course it is wiser to be able to afford children before you have them. Of course it is wiser to be in a position where you've handled your own issues and your trauma and your upbringing, and you have the desire to have children before you bring that into your life. Even with the 1, 2, maybe 3 pretty things said about children in the Bible. The Bible, as a rule book for parenting, might be the worst one ever written. And that's clearly not its goal, by the way. And considering the greatest father of all, the good father, the example we get of God himself in the Bible, we couldn't have a worse parent to emulate. I actually believe that. The character of Yahweh, as he responds to his children, he sends the vast majority of them to hell. He watches as every single day millions of them die from horrific, preventable ways. And that's just when he stays out of it. Again, all the examples I gave you earlier from the Old Testament, where he is the one commanding the murder of these innocents. And by the way, that's just children. Again, this whole point is that mankind, humans, have this inherent value. Where do we see that from this God? Do not take parental advice from this book. Do not model yourself as a parent after Yahweh. That is a recipe for disaster. So that's really all I have to say today. Again, we could have talked about this longer. I've meant to do a video where I compare God as a father, and I think we'll still do that, and we'll get into all of the examples. But until then, go and watch this priest's entire interview and see if you can spot all the other inconsistencies and problems. Anyways, keep thinking. I'd like to personally thank my top tiers of support: my Iconoclast and Boris GVI, Jason, Joe, Kitboga, Perry, Rokkit, Shawn, and StrongRex, my Humanist heroes, Imposter, James, Jarrod, Kristi, and Thronus, my Atheist advocates, Caleb, David, Jeff, Jeffrey, Mrs. Webb, Paul, Sparky, and Todd, as well as all of my secular scholar patrons. If you believe in the mission of this channel or you just enjoy its content, please consider joining these fine people.